For many years, the concept of imprisonment as a form of punishment was entirely foreign to most European countries. Sure, in Scotland, we had the Tolbooths, where criminals would be held pending trial, but that was it. After the trial, no one returned to the iron cages in the village Tolbooth. If found innocent, you were released. But if you were found to be guilty of the crime, you would pay a price, commonly in the form of a debt, banishment, mutilation, and depending on the severity, execution. Yet once the price was paid, you were free to return to your daily life. This system functioned without issue for hundreds of years, until one odd day in 1724, when Margret Dickenson was to be executed. Half-hangit Maggie. Margret Dickenson was born in the year 1702 in one of the oldest Scottish towns, Musselburgh, which sits a few miles east of Edinburgh. It was in that seaside town that young Maggie was brought up in a strict religious setting, which was fairly common for that time and place. In her young days, Maggie helped her family by working at the harbour, preparing and selling fish. It was here she would meet the young fisherman that she would one day marry. The name of Maggie's husband is unknown, but it is thought that Maggie was married around the age of 18. Unfortunately, she wouldn't have much time to spend with her new husband, as her marriage occurred near the end of the Great Northern War, a conflict between the Tsardom of Russia and the Swedish Empire, which was in much need for new conscripts. While her husband was at war, Maggie travelled to the border town of Kelso and found work in a small inn. During that time, she would become well acquainted with the innkeeper's son, who was said to seduce the then 21-year-old Maggie. As a consequence of this seduction, young Maggie became pregnant. At this time in our history, there was great guilt and humiliation forced upon those who would engage in sex without marriage, especially if a child was to be born of that sin. It was common for women who had been found guilty of fornication to be forced to sit in specific chairs during Sunday church service, where the minister would publicly humiliate and reprimand the poor women. This, more often than not, resulted in the woman becoming an outcast of the town and being disowned by her family and friends. The fear and intimidation of these hideous laws would lead many young pregnant women to destroy the child in secret or hide their pregnancy, rather than submit to the public shame and torment. Maggie was one of these women. For months, the young girl would try to cover her pregnancy, but as time continued, the changes to her body became increasingly obvious. Rumours began to spread throughout the town of Maggie's adultery and her hidden pregnancy, but the woman would deny each and every story. For a while, this kept the church and the law at a safe distance. Then one day, the body of a newborn was found near the house of Margret Dickenson. Instantly, the woman was apprehended and held in the Edinburgh Tolbooth on the charge of murder. It was said that Maggie was most cooperative with the council and the minister. She acknowledged her wrongdoing in committing adultery, but she wholeheartedly denied the murder of her child. She admitted to concealing the pregnancy. She did not want the town to know of her adultery and was in great fear of being publicly shamed in the church. Maggie told the council that she was taken very suddenly with labour, much sooner than she had expected, and her pain prevented her from getting the assistance of a midwife or even a neighbour. This resulted in the unfortunate death of her child. A local surgeon would perform an autopsy on the child, and through the use of a now heavily discredited test, determined that the child had been born alive and well. This was all the evidence needed for the council to convict Maggie of murder and sentence her to death. On the 2nd of September 1724, Mrs. Margret Dickenson would be hanged in a public execution in Edinburgh's Grassmarket. After being pronounced dead, the young woman's corpse would be fought over as her friends and family struggled with local medical students for possession of the body. Eventually, after a small-scale riot, Maggie's friends and relatives would gain custody of her now cold body. Maggie was placed in a coffin, which was to be taken back to her hometown of Musselburgh for burial. While en route to Musselburgh, the men in charge of the body and the cart would stop in the village of Peppermill in order to visit a local pub. While the men quenched their thirst, one of them noticed the lid of the coffin slowly rising, before swiftly falling again. Quickly he gathered his colleagues and ran to the cart, where they all witnessed the coffin lid rising and falling, as if the body was trying to escape. Filled with fear and anxiety, the men crept ever closer and slowly uncovered the body of Maggie. As the lid fell to the floor, the young woman would rise from her deathbed, terrifying the men and causing them to flee. A local gardener, who was also drinking at the pub, saw this strange scenario and leapt up from his seat and drew a small knife, which he used to cut the pale girl in the coffin. As the crimson blood poured from Maggie's vein, the gardener knew her to be alive. She was taken inside the pub and given food and drink. Her cut was tended, and after a well-deserved night's sleep, she was healthy enough to leave the pub and walk the rest of the way home to Musselburgh. Maggie had survived execution. It didn't take long for the wild story of Margret Dickenson to spread throughout Edinburgh and even reach the far corners of Scotland. The council took Maggie into custody for a second time, and she would appear in front of the court once more. Many of the council members were mystified that the woman they had sentenced to death 2 days prior now stood before them once again. According to the laws in Scotland at that time, a person upon whom judgment of the court has been executed has no more to suffer and is forever discharged. So it was by that logic Maggie was found to be beyond further persecution and was released to live out the rest of her days as a free woman. Margret Dickenson would go on to live for another 40 years and have many children. During that time, she became universally known as Half-hangit Maggie, the woman who survived the hangman's noose. There are a few differing versions of this tale, but the core of the story is entirely true. Maggie did survive execution. In one version, Maggie's original husband did not leave to war on his own accord. In fact, he was forced into military service. Yet another tale suggests that he actually joined a fishing crew in Newcastle, and that explained his absence. What truly happened to Maggie's child is still unknown. To the day of her death in 1765, Margaret swore that she did not kill her child, and only covered up her pregnancy through fear. I, for one, tend to believe her. The surgeon's techniques have since been discredited, and I can see how the fear of public humiliation and ridicule would force these women into obscuring the truth. This has been the odd tale of Half-hangit Maggie, a case where fate seemed to make the just decision, and what I believe was an innocent woman was set free from the barbaric laws of 18th century Scotland. Thank you for watching, and a special thank you to all my patrons who support the channel and help me keep these tales alive. There are many stories and theories about how poor Maggie survived the execution. One source claims that she was close friends with the rope maker, who supplied the hangman with a tampered piece of rope. This rope would break early and allow Maggie's survival. It is also said that she may have made a deal with the hangman, or the rope was not prepared correctly. One source claims that the rope was wet as it had been raining on that day, so to dry the rope the hangman held a torch to it, but burned it by mistake, weakening it just enough to save Maggie's life. These are all interesting possibilities, but so far I have found no valid or contemporary source that gives credence to any of these theories. I did, however, find out that throughout history, and even right up till the modern day, many fortunate or unfortunate people have survived all manner of executions, and although it was uncommon, it was by no means unheard of. I want to give an extra shout out to one viewer in particular, whose name I will not attempt to pronounce, for suggesting the tale of Half-hangit Maggie. Thanks, and until next time, Slán Java.